urgent Caden of the Union. 303rd Infantry trudged slowly and wearily across the desolate cratered landscape. Next to him were the remains of some large municipal structure, a cornucopia of shattered remnants spilling out to little the cracked, Duracrete roadway. Even as he watched, another brick tumbled from the cracked and collapsing walls. Likely disturbed by his presence and his heavy armored footfalls, he sucked in another lungful of filtered and recycled air, the low-pitched whine of his power armor's life support a constant background buzz that filled his ears with white noise. It dulled the mind and gave lethargy to his movements, though the pain and minor blood loss were likely factored into that as well. Caden shook his armored head slightly in a futile attempt to clear his mind, the armored gorget that rose to protect his neck, limiting his movement somewhat. He checked his weapons again as he stopped near to a crossroads, the action nearly automatic. He had his heavy thermomace strapped to his side, and the retractable chain that held his heavy M2 Mk12 machine gun was still attached tightly despite the roughness of his fall. He shook his head again as he checked his internal multitector for contacts but saw nothing. He breathed in a little shakily and then stepped forwards once more into that bleak, shattered desolation. How had it come to this? He found himself wondering. He thought back to that morning. Caden's day had started out as many of his days of late had, with him waking to a cold splash of water on the face and lukewarm rations from the mobile battle kitchen. The cooks had made some manner of pseudo-egg and vat meat on toast. All in all, not terrible. Ixie, his second-in-command, had tossed him a fungibar and told him they had been requested specifically to do a hot drop at a key enemy strongpoint on the west side of Edgetown. Not great news, but a welcome change of pace from the last few weeks of trudging monotony. That wasn't to say he didn't like the opportunity to take things a bit easier, but the grinding day-after-day slog of urban combat had long since begun to take its toll on his squad and himself. His inner spirit longed for the fires of combat, and he hated himself for it. The blood and death of this war was an abhorrence, and the fact that he was so good at what he did had only made his inner turmoil worse. The whole squad had gathered in the secondary mustering field before a Red Dwarf-class assault dropship had arrived to ferry them to their mission's drop location. The boarding and departure of the shuttle had gone as smooth as silk, but had quickly taken a turn for the worse as the assault was met with early resistance over the town's ruins. Sitting in his heavy, powered armor with its centimeters of bone-hardened titan steel and ballistic bucky cloth nanoweave synth muscles, he felt powerful, invulnerable even. Like nothing in this wider universe could ever do him any harm. And then the missile had struck. In an instant of eye-searing fire, the dropship had been torn asunder. At least 3 of his squad were removed in that instant, either perishing in the explosion or being torn from their positions as a great bleeding rent was torn into the side of the dropship. He did not know. Caden himself had been rocked by the blast, as he had been locked in directly across from it, across from Ixie. He, grunted low in his throat as he held in some manner of emotional distress. She was fine. In her placard armor, the secondary blast would not have fazed her. But falling from that incredible height without warning, even the powerful inertial dampeners of their suits might not have been enough protection to keep her whole. He shook his head, eyes a little bleary as he was unable to wipe them under the thick duramite and steel of his helmet. He kept walking. The ruins continued to spread around him for miles and miles. The shuttle had been knocked far off course by the blast, far enough that as the craft was struck again and one wing was shorn off entirely, that when he had ordered the others to make an emergency hot drop, he had no idea where they had landed. The ship was losing altitude fast enough that he worried they may strike the ground before they could effect an escape. In an effort to save what he could, Caden had stayed aboard the shuttle as it continued to fall. Tearing open the door, to the cockpit he had found both pilots dead, their corpses riddled with shrapnel till they looked less like people and more like ground meat. Now he was no pilot, but like most specialists, he had some simulator training on the basics, and so stomped in to try and land the rest of them safely. In his bulky, powered armor, Caden's shoulders barely fit through the cockpit doorway. But he pushed forwards, widening the entrance slightly in the process with a shriek of rending metal. If they made it out of this, then he was sure Command would forgive the minor destruction of Union assets. Using all the skill and luck he possessed, he halted their headlong descent with only moments till they were a smoldering crater. Not even. His heavy armor would have protected him from 20,000-odd tons of the Red Dwarf shuttle crumpling on top of his head. He had spoken quickly to the remaining 303 on his comms. "Emergency drop! Now!" He hadn't heard any answers, but his advanced HUD had informed him that one by one the remaining green lights flicked to orange as direct contact was lost. He had tried to level out as best he could before jamming the controls in place and making a beeline for the rear hatch. He only had to make it out the back. His chances of survival were much greater trusting his armor to save him, rather than a safe landing from the rapidly disintegrating dropship. He grabbed a spare canister of ammunition for his 50 and clipped it to his belt as he neared the open ramp at the end of the shuttle. He dared not tarry to grab any more. The ground whipped past far too fast to make out specific details as he stepped up to the side of the ramp and hesitated for only the briefest of moments. He heard another sound over the whipping of the wind, a terrible shrieking scream that turned his blood to ice. Another missile was streaking towards the ship, and this wasn't a shoulder-fired manpad. No, this had the sound of a static defense system. The huge rocket would turn the ship to hypersonic splinters, and it was heartbeats away. Caden jumped, and his stomach nearly left his mouth as the winds and G-forces immediately sent him into a spiral. He used his HUD to deploy his suit's limited aerial maneuvering flaps, and the spin stopped hard enough to bruise his ribs on the inside of his padded armor. He had only had time to activate the inertial dampeners in his armor before he had slammed through the roof of a building, his velocity carrying him through several floors before he ended his journey buried under a ton of rubble in some manner of sub-basement. At least the collapsing floors had broken his fall somewhat. He winced as he remembered the glowing fire that had spread through his body after the initial moments of impact. Something had definitely fractured, maybe a rib. But then his suit's auto-injectors had hit him with a local anesthetic, and the pain had receded to a bearable background ache. Enough to still feel, but not so much as to incapacitate him, nor overly slow his reactions. Caden shook his head again as he walked, the power armor squealing slightly as it mimicked the motion with some difficulty. That had been nearly 15 minutes ago. In that time, he had discovered 3 important things. The first 2 were the fact he was relatively unharmed and miraculously in nearly full working order, with the exception of his long-range radio antenna. The transceiver had been smashed beyond repair as he had impacted the ground, and without the spare equipment that had perished with their transport, he couldn't even effectively replace it. He took another few steps and stopped, his head cocked slightly as he picked up a series of popping sounds. That had sounded almost like a suppressed. The thought was suddenly interrupted as something impacted his chest with a loud snap. The bullet had been hurled at him with tremendous velocity, the heavy projectile crossing the hundreds of meters between him and the distant sniper in moments. The first shot must have missed, or he would never have heard the supersonic rounds before they hit him. Caden twitched as the bullet barely scuffed the hardened alloy of his heavy assault plate, a loud zipping sound filling his suit's speakers, as the armor-piercing projectile ricocheted off into the rubble. "Son of a..." he swore, and then dove for cover with a heavy thud. His armor was not made for grace or agility. He had been spotted. It had taken them long enough. He supposed he had been asking for trouble, walking out in the middle of the open like he had. He checked the integrity of his armor and then smiled. He was still at over 95% integrity. The sniper's bullet had done little but scratch the outermost layer of his plate. Unslinging his heavy machine gun, he crouched as best he could in his amour's thick, heavy plates as he bounded up the face of a nearby rubble pile. He peeked out over the top and was forced to duck as another shot whipped by close enough to stir up dust on the shattered masonry beside him. But it had been enough. He chuckled darkly as his helmet replayed the recorded data. In moments, the smart HUD had displayed the direction and likely location of the shooter. He hefted his 50 calibre machine gun and prepared to go over the top. The M2 PMK-12 was an ancient design, hailing back to pre-space age Earth. The gun had gone through as many major design iterations as it had wars, and what he had now was a distant great-great-grandchild of the original. Despite not being built as a precision weapon, the gun was still more than capable of slinging. A 900-grain Titan steel cord armor piercing bullet at over 1,000 meters per second. So while the sniper was hidden behind solid cover more than 300 meters away, the single bullet Caden fired tore through the brick wall they were using as cover, still impacting their lightly armored body with enough force to throw their crippled and ruptured body 8 feet backwards off the 3rd story of the ruin they had been perched in. The corpse tumbled to the ground amid a small cascade of debris. as Caden nodded in self-satisfaction and switched his gun back to full auto. Precision weapon it might not be, but with the advanced targeting computer of his armor slaved to the servos of his arms, the weapon was as accurate as it was possible for such a device to be. 300 meters was child's play for a gun that was more than capable of swatting light aircraft from the sky in the right hands. Caden stood and scanned the close horizon for additional threats. Then he looked up into the sky. He didn't see any drones or spotters, but that in and of itself was no guarantee they weren't there. Hell, there could have been a low-level spy satellite in orbit trained on his sorry ass, and he would never know till a barrage of heavy missiles dropped right down his throat. He put the concerns aside as he tromped back down to the street below. There was no use in worrying about things he had no control over. Only reacting to them as they happened had saved his life. One could anticipate any number of scenarios, but it would always be that single unforeseen factor that would pull you down and leave you bleeding in the dirt. With the enemy sniper dead and the way now seemingly clear, Caden continued his slow march forwards, sure that he would come upon other members of his squad eventually. The shuttle had been struck shortly after crossing over the front lines, and judging by their speed and the length of time they were out of control, he might have ended up several kilometers behind enemy lines. It was lucky they had crashed in the remains of Edgetown, as the ruins were largely uninhabited by either side. He shook his head slightly as he felt a pulled muscle twinge in his back. It was going to be a long day. Of that he was certain. Caden walked for another few minutes before he thought he could hear the sounds of fighting in the near distance. He cocked his head a little, instinctively trying to make out the direction of the noise, even as his suit systems pinpointed its source for him. It looked to be coming from nearby. The pops of gunfire and cracks of laser capacitors were near, just 2 streets over, in fact. Caden rushed towards the noise as fast as he could, which in his heavy-powered armor was surprisingly swift. His armor made a racket as he clattered over debris and even through the remains of a doorway in a half-destroyed wall. As the rest of the wall collapsed behind him, Caden vaulted over the partially crushed remains of a burned-out ground car. The metal screeched in protest as it momentarily bore the enormous weight of his armor. But then he was across and had his heavy machine gun in his hands as he skidded to a halt at the top of a nearby collapsed structure. What he found over the top of the rise both elated and terrified him. One of his squad was pinned down behind the quickly deteriorating remains of a bombed-out convenience store. While his long-range radio was still beyond saving, his HUD immediately flickered to life as a small icon appeared in the upper left as it recognized the short-range IFF tag of one of his squad and connected with a soft pinging sound. The power armored figure fighting for their life must have noticed it too as their suits connected, their head immediately snapping his way even amidst the chaos of the previously hopeless firefight. A voice crackled to life as the embattled man immediately opened comms to him. It was Justin, one of the ground pounders that had jumped at the last minute. The young human hollered loudly over the link, "Oh, it's damn good to see you, sir. I could use some help." Caden didn't respond. He was too busy lining up his heavy gun on the rich bevy of targets that were presented before him. Justin seemed to realize what he was planning and dove for cover even as Caden's .50 caliber machine gun roared to life. Even inside the protective layers of Duramite, Titan steel, and aggregate hyperdiamond Bucky Weave synth muscles, the weapon was devastatingly loud. The muzzle blast pummeled his armored body like fists of air, but he braced himself as he worked his aim from left to right and back again. Most of the hegemony soldiers were cut down in one long continuous stream of bullets that smashed through. Solid cover and soft flesh alike leaving gaping holes. But not all. He was rocked back as something impacted his left shoulder like a hammer thrown by a god. But he remained standing. The incredible weight and synthetic strength of his suit kept him upright, even as another of those blows impacted him in the chest. He identified the source even as the large gray-suited figure rose from the cover they had ducked behind. It was a Yone. The large, furry alien lined up their huge rifle on him, and their bestial face twisted into a grin as the sights lined up square on his armored eye. He didn't have time to dodge, and his gun was pointing the wrong way. He twitched, involuntarily, as there was a loud sound, but he was not dead. Instead, the hegemony soldier jerked spasmodically as the top of their triangular head was turned to pulverized meat. Their legs crumpled and their twitching tails slapped against the ground as their body fell into a boneless heap. Justin climbed back to his feet, his smoking weapon dropping to retract on its chain as he settled himself and then checked his plates. He was battered. Bullet holes and smoking dents covered his heavy suit of McThur's demolisher armor. He had taken a particularly nasty hit right on the gorget that seemed to be hampering his helmet's movement. Despite the fact, he shouldered the large MR-112 he was carrying and snapped a quick salute to Caden as he stomped down the rubble, into the shallow defilade the other man was in. "Boy, am I glad to see you, sir," Justin began, but Caden cut him off. It was nice to see the younger man too, but their mission took precedence. He cut the other man off with a wave and a short grunt. "Yes. Have you seen any of the others?" If Justin was hurt by the sudden change in topic, he didn't show it. Instead, he answered almost immediately. Caden turned his head in the direction the younger man pointed as he rattled off, "Yes, but we were separated nearly immediately. Arvok and Harrelstein jumped before me, and as I landed, I thought I saw Val's placard armor hit a building a few hundred meters that way. But that's all I saw before I landed on a burned-out cargo carrier. Took me a minute to untangle myself. Then before I could go and look for them, I got ambushed." He stopped and seemed to try looking around before swearing. "Damned helmet!" Caden reached into his utility compartment at the waist of his armor and pulled out a plasma torch and multi-tool. He motioned for Justin to stand in front of him and used the plasma torch to soften the armor near to the damage, while he did some quick field repairs. He spoke as he fixed the damage. "I was the last one off, and my long range was knocked out in the crash. Have you been able to get a fix on our position? I would imagine we are a little off course." Caden grunted as he shaved off another chunk of damaged plate. The whole situation was completely foobar, no doubt about it, but they were in about the tightest spot he had ever been in. Situationally speaking, Justin shrugged, nonplussed by Caden's rusty attempt at humor. "I have tried multiple times. I think we are being jammed." Caden grunted again. That was not ideal, but it made a strange sort of sense. Either the enemy knew their general location and had thrown a blackout order over the entire area, or there was a major offensive happening and they had just happened to get caught out right in the middle of it. Either way, they were in some deep shit. No calls for support or backup, no rescue. He finished the repairs on Justin's damaged armor quickly. The younger man cocked his head and then rolled his shoulders as he looked around. "Oh, that's so much better. I can actually turn my head now, thank you, sir." Justin sounded far too pleased given their current situation. Caden just grunted again. He was in a foul mood and didn't feel like responding to the other ground pounder's chipper attitude. So instead, he looked around the ruins and then towards the body of the Yown he had almost been shot by. "Grab any grenades or explosives you can. They might come in handy. Take a radio too. Maybe we can use them to listen in on their chatter." Justin didn't respond, but the way he quickly started checking over bodies showed that he had heard. Caden glanced over the corpse and grabbed a couple of high explosive and one frag grenade. He stuffed them into an empty pouch and tried to ignore the bright red blood that was staining the bottoms of his boots. He grimaced. He hated to treat the dead in such a manner, enemies or not. He was an old hand at killing, but it never really got any easier for him. He swallowed heavily and moved to the next. In short order, they had scavenged what they could and left the rest to rot. Scavengers would likely pick the bodies clean in their absence anyways. He motioned in the direction the other man had indicated earlier. "Okay, let's move out. Stay sharp. We seem to be attracting a lot of attention." Justin nodded this time and hefted his large rifle meaningfully. They set out again. Step by step, they walked through scorched ruins. This had been a vibrant and bustling city not more than 5 years before, but the advent of the rebellion and the resulting carnage had reduced most of the brightly colored buildings to so much ashen rubble and twisted metal scrap. Caden forced himself to stop and really look around at the carnage the war had wrought. He looked at the destroyed buildings, and for the first time in weeks, saw them not as potential ambush sites or hard cover. He saw lives destroyed, businesses lost, and history erased. His fists clenched inside his armor, the powered gauntlets. He wore creaking ominously as he had to suppress the sudden rage that threatened to overtake him. He was usually the calm and collected one, but this was his homeworld that the hegemony of independent systems had slowly been battering down. As he took another step, he stopped as he heard something break under his armored foot. He looked down. He had just stepped on the corner of a mirror, one that seemed to have remarkably survived the devastation that filled the room and surroundings only to shatter upon his passing. Justin groaned quietly behind him. "Oh man, that's bad karma, sir. Lady Luck smile upon us. We didn't mean it." He said the intonation quickly, and Caden grunted his affirmation. He wasn't particularly devout to any faith or belief, but even he said a quick mental prayer to the patron saint of all warriors, thieves, and merchants. Maybe Lady Luck would see fit to side with them on this, but the slight sinking feeling in his middle told him otherwise. Caden motioned towards a distant structure that Justin had pointed out in his earlier report. The two of them were hunkered, down on the second story of a partially collapsed residential building. The blackened walls of other structures reached towards the sky all around like skeletal fingers, their empty windows and cracked facade more than a little unnerving. But it certainly beat sitting in dirty, mud-filled trenches, waiting for the next barrage of heavy artillery. It was quiet. No, not quiet, for the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire were ever present in the remains of Edgetown. But much more relaxed than he might have expected this close to the front. The dull humming that sat at the back of his head started to increase in pitch and volume slowly as he shook his head slightly. The town had not been particularly large to begin with, but as it was set directly at the mouth of the only mountain pass for nearly 200 kilometers in either direction, it had quickly become a point of interest for both sides of this disastrous conflict. He had to admit that he was getting rather tired of the oppressive nature of their posting. The once bright rural landscape all around the small town had become a blasted forest of trenchworks and burned-out tank hulls. The dead remains of scraggly trees and bomb craters filled with toxic mud waiting to drown the unwary. Artillery from both sides had made quick work of anything in and around the city that might have been considered strategic value, and as such, the bombed-out remains had been largely abandoned by both hegemony and Union forces, which was the reason they had been flying over it in the first place. Clearly, it wasn't as abandoned as their intel had thought, what with the manpad putting them down hard and their contact with enemy forces already. He realized that Justin was speaking to him. The humming in his ears dropped in pitch as he shook his head and nodded to the younger private. "Yes, I missed part of that. You said the left looks clear. On what grounds do you make that observation?" Justin sent a direct visual feed from his own helmet's sensors. The image that pulled up on the corner of Caden's internal helmet display showed a small clutch of objects that he at first mistook for rumpled piles of rags. It was when he noticed the fresh blood splashed around them that he realized they must be dead combatants or civilians. "I really hope those aren't civvies," he thought to himself. Out loud, he nodded slightly and spoke. "Okay, so somebody out there is shooting as well, and judging by the pattern of the spray, I would assume it was from our direction. Somebody scouting the ruins with us?" He mused aloud. He would have rubbed his chin if there hadn't been centimeters of thick protective armor over it. Justin made a small neutral noise, one of neither affirmation nor disagreement. Caden weighed the pros and cons. On one hand, if there was somebody with heavy weapons wandering around the ruins with them, then it could be a potential problem. But it might also be signs that more of his squad had survived and was nearby. They would have to check the bodies more closely and figure out if they were hegemony or Union dead. He made a series of hand gestures to Justin, and the two of them descended to the ground floor through a hole in the next room's floor. As they thumped out into the street, Caden couldn't help but feel a little exposed. Sure, he was wearing the equivalent of a light vehicle in armor plates and armed to a similar degree, but he was used to having his squad nearby in case things got hot. He glanced into the corner of his HUD, which showed a rear view of what was behind him. Justin wasn't a bad soldier. In fact, he was damn good. One had to be even be considered to join the Ground Pounders' elite assault corps. But he was still young, full of spit and vinegar, as the old-timers might say. He was impulsive and prone to making rash decisions. And right now, he was mad. Caden smiled at that. So was he. But he needed to help the younger man focus that anger into a dagger-like point. So he took a moment to talk to the junior trooper. "How are you holding up, Justin?" he asked, in as conversational a tone as he could manage, trying to sound like he was simply striking up a conversation. Justin saw straight through his charade and responded stiffly, "I am fine, Sergeant. It would take more than this to break me. If you think that I am some sort of liability just because of the incident last month..." Caden cut him off with a grimace and a short grunt. He had not really been thinking about the mentioned incident. Justin had gotten trapped inside a burning bunker that had collapsed on him. His armor had protected him, but the young man had been trapped for several hours in that smoldering hell. Caden swallowed. "No, I don't think that at all. His voice must have carried some of his internal turmoil with it, as Justin didn't sound convinced. "Whatever you say, sir." Caden muted himself with a glance at his HUD and swore colorfully. Well, that had not gone the way he had hoped. It took them only another minute to reach the intersection where Justin had spotted the bodies. Caden raised a hand in the universal signal to halt, and then scanned the surroundings with both passive and active short-range sensors. He smirked as he detected a cleverly concealed explosive device rigged up to the bodies. It seemed that somebody had left a grenade bundle under one of the corpses, so when they were moved or inspected, they would lead to a deadly surprise. He stood and nodded. Whoever killed them is long gone, it would seem. Bodies are cooling, dead a little more than half an hour, I would assume. And whoever did it left a nice little surprise. Justin stood near to his side, a little distance away, in case of explosives or sniper fire. They look like hegemony auxiliaries. Not combat roles, though. Scavengers, maybe? He sounded like he wanted to spit. Caden could well understand the other man's distaste. Both sides in this war were experiencing strain on their logistics, but Caden still didn't like the idea of sending scavenging parties to rob the dead. Sure, taking weapons and ammo off dead combatants was something the Union did too. He himself had done as much earlier. But to disturb the dead after they had been rotten and forgotten without reclaiming the bodies, it was dishonorable to say the least. But it was war, and desperation blurred the lines of morality too much in his opinion. He hated himself for thinking it, but he wondered what the purpose of his revulsion really was. After all, there were living soldiers that surely could benefit from the gear that the dead no longer needed. No, not like that! He frowned again as he thought it. He looked around the street. The buildings on 3 corners were still relatively intact. He saw a hollow movie store and a small clothing outlet. The other across from them looked residential in structure and had no clearly identifiable signs on its dusty exterior. It was 4 stories tall and would make as good a vantage point as any. Caden motioned to the building, and the pair of them rushed across the street, their heavy footfalls disturbing the layers of ash and dust that had gathered in drifts like gray snow along the edges of the abandoned street. He shuffled around a partially collapsed crater and looked down into it as they passed. The bottom of the hole was filled with scummy water. The surface was an evil-looking greenish sludge marred by an almost oily sheen. He suppressed the urge to stop and heave a large chunk of duracrete into it to make a splash. In his power armor, he could have picked up a really big rock if he had wanted to. It took them only moments to cross the barren gap that was the intersection, and the entire time Caden's neck hairs had been prickling as if he were being watched by unseen eyes. Justin heaved a sigh as they stopped. "I think the servos in my left leg are damaged. It's not moving quite as gracefully as I am used to." Caden swore again. "Damn it! What else is broken?" He asked it more to himself, but Justin answered angrily anyway. "Well, not to be any more of a burden, but I lost my auxiliary pack when I got ripped out of the dropship and don't know where it landed. So I only have the ammo that I am carrying in my close quarters." The younger man's helmeted head gave no emotion away, but the manner in which he said it belied his frustration as he patted the heavy Plaskin truncheon hanging at his side. Caden nodded slightly, not enough to move his helmet though, and then gestured to the residential complex they had decided to use for cover. He didn't feel like apologizing. "I want you to cover the bottom floor. Use the stairwell to get out of sight of the doors. I am going to get on the top floor to scout out the surroundings." As if to punctuate his words, there was the distant crackle of multiple rocket impacts, followed by the larger and more bass rumble of something large detonating somewhere in the distance. Justin snapped a clunky salute and followed him halfway, up the first flight before turning to cover the entrance with his anti-material rifle. The stairs creaked ominously under the prodigious weight of Caden's Mach III demolisher armor, but despite their loud protestations, the stairwell held and he was able to stomp his way up to the dusty and partially wrecked halls on the top floor. He glanced around at the top of the stairs. The hallway looked disheveled. Scraps of rubble and cracks in the walls belied the truth of the damage that spread throughout the city ruins. He stepped over what he hoped was just a pile of discarded clothing and entered one of the nearby rooms. He took stock of its condition. It actually seemed to be in remarkable shape in spite of the surrounding desolation. The walls were only minorly damaged and the carpet was filled with dust and ash that had accumulated through the shattered windows. Broken glass sparkled on the umber carpet, and he stepped around a small lounge sofa that looked made for a Wiener Fellien. Caden took a few deep breaths and hunched, trying to calm his quickly beating heart. Sure, he had been in stressful situations before, but this whole shit show really took the cake. He shook his head and stood straight once more. He took position near to one of the windows that faced their direction of travel and used his suit's powerful sensors to scout the land between them and the large smoking structure that Justin said he had seen Val land in. From his new heightened vantage point, it appeared to be some manner of shopping center or mall district. It was long and wide with tall glass windows, most of them dark and empty, likely shattered at some point during the heavy fighting when the city was taken. At first it looked as clear as the blasted no man's land outside the city limits, but as his sensors adjusted to background levels, they started to pick out distant movement. And there was a lot of movement to the far north. Oh, man. Caden breathed out as he started trying to add figures together. He caught glimpses of armored vehicles and entire platoons as they flashed briefly in the gaps between the distant buildings along another of Edgetown's main streets. If he was reading things correctly, there were upwards of 2 entire infantry companies moving up onto friendly positions through the town. How were they attacking so brazenly in the open, he wondered to himself? Surely they would be spotted and picked off by rocket or artillery fire. He stopped as another thought came to him, one that made him freeze briefly with its terrible consequence. They might be moving up in support of an already ongoing offensive. Reserve troops on their way to bolster a raging battle. Command had reported heightened enemy activity in the vicinity of the front. They had warned him of it before they left that morning. Caden turned up the senses of his helmet, trying to hear if there was any kind of clamor in the distance that might signal the beginnings of some grander battle. But it was fruitless. The all-pervasive continued shelling and rocket barrages drowned out any greater chaos in the distance that he might have picked up. As they were behind enemy lines already, they were likely more than 5 kilometers from any potential action. Stuck as they were on the far side of Edgetown in the middle of a hostile advance, Caden knew instinctively that the smart thing to do would be to try and make his way back towards friendly lines as fast as possible, pushing the power capabilities of his suit's anutronic microfusion boron reactor to its absolute limits, but he scoffed at the idea as soon as it formed, in his mind. That was completely out of the question while he still had a mission to complete. He turned and stopped as he thought of his missing squad mates. Make that 2 missions. He keyed the close-net comms. Justin, there is significant, and I mean very significant enemy movement less than a kilometer to the east of our position. Recommend that we wrap things up as fast as possible before anyone decides to send a company or 2 our way. He started out of the room and back down to the lower floor, even as Justin replied, "A company? What the hell? What did you see?" "Out there," Caden grinned wryly to himself, not in humor though, as he replied a bit sardonically. "A lot, Justin. Just a lot. At least 2 or 3 infantry companies, maybe an armored company of bombs. It was hard to tell." Justin was silent, and Caden reached his position at the top of the last stairwell. He tapped the other man on the shoulder as he approached. "Okay, let's head out. Try to stay low profile for as long as possible. I have no idea how many hegemony troops are out combing the ruins for us and the others." He paused. He wanted to say more, but couldn't muster the words for once. He felt a deep pit forming in his middle, a void where his heart was, as he thought of Ixie injured and alone with all those black stars out there. He quashed the dread. There was no room for it here. He had a job to do. And he was going to do it. No complaining and no hesitation. Hesitation would kill just as surely as an enemy's blade. So with a final nod to the younger man, he led the way out of the building and into the street once more. He knew the way now. He had plotted a mental course through the debris-strewn streets that took them there quickly and had the least chance of accidental detection. There could be any number of enemies camped out in the darkened windows of the surviving buildings on the larger main streets. So Caden had elected to travel off the beaten path as it were, taking rubble-choked alleys and through the burned husks of larger structures. It took longer than he would have liked, and he tried to ignore the ominous creaking of damaged ceilings and the cracked walls of the large brickwork buildings. They had the mission to keep them focused, and so he kept walking, one armored foot in front of the next. The distance was short, and in less than 5 minutes, Caden found himself and Justin hunkered down across the concourse of the mall-like structure that Justin had seen Val fall into. It was about 100 meters long and lined with smaller shops on both sides, with a series of taller buildings to its northern face. He took a second to observe. If he had been separated and needed a place to lay low, he would have picked the larger structure on the north face, as it had good lines of sight and a defensible position should one be discovered. That was the most likely location of their missing squad mate. Caden motioned quietly for Justin to take the far wall and move towards the objective. Justin nodded and gripped his M112 with dangerous intent, the slightly glowing eye slits of his helmet illuminating the wall next to his head with a subtle blue glow. Caden hefted his own weapon. He had hopes that they would not need them, as firing the heavy machine gun in such an enclosed space would be devastatingly loud and might attract unwanted attention. Then he snorted, even as the cautious thought crossed his mind. If he was forced to use it, then it would be because they had already attracted unwanted attention. He spoke softly. "Justin, keep your sensors active. There shouldn't be any danger of line-of-sight detection in here." Not from outside the building, at least. Caden swallowed heavily. He was nervous, not because there could be enemies lying in wait to ambush them. Enemies and the threat they posed had long since ceased to be such a worry. No, he was worried that they might find Val in a condition less desirable than he hoped. He hesitated to even think about the word dead, as if thinking it to himself would somehow make it a reality. Their heavy armored footfalls made subtle crunching noises that carried farther through the ominously empty mall than he was comfortable with. Rubble and glass covered the hard tile floor, impossible to avoid. Up ahead, about 60 meters, was the dark, open maw of the theater. The flashy digital posters and hollow emitters were all dark now. Lifeless like the rest of the structure, he held up a hand and then dropped to one knee as he thought he heard a sound from up ahead. Before he could say anything to Justin, he was surprised, as another of the indicators on his HUD lit up with a red warning. They were being pinged by an unknown source. He immediately sent a warning to Justin, but the other man must have gotten the alert too, as his armor jerked slightly and he stepped into the cover of a decorative pillar. It likely would not do anything to stop bullets from a determined attacker, but it provided visual cover and a sense of control. Caden stood slowly and tried to remain calm as he frantically looked around the mall. His sensors were searching for the source of the ping, but he couldn't seem to detect any active power signatures. That was bad. Either they had been pinged from some manner of cloaked or shielded entity, or he twitched once more as a fizzy and crackling voice sounded inside his helmet suddenly, the voice accompanied with another of the squad indicators flashing to life on his HUD. "Oh, it's you. It's good to see you, Sergeant. You have hostiles on the floor in front of you. They are just about to—" "Look out!" the voice shouted, crackling and then dying as the sound of weapons fire erupted from the doorway to the theater in front. Of him. He only had time to realize that the voice had been Val before a series of cracks announced the arrival of the enemy. There were a few small beeps as his armor registered solid hits to his upper thigh and abdomen. But neither shot had even penetrated the outer layer of his armor, and so he focused on the attackers. There were 6 of them, half a hegemony fire team. That meant that the other 6 were likely still occupied deeper inside the structure. If they could deal with these fast, then they would have effectively cut the enemy force in half, making the other half that much easier to mop up. None of them seemed to be armed with anything heavier than a beam sniper. The NUV L3 ultraviolet beamer would cause problems if it hit him in a vulnerable spot. So instead of standing still and becoming an inviting target, he decided to rush straight at them, guns blazing. Probably not the most tactically sound move, but he was in a hurry. He shouted at Justin to move up just as he depressed the trigger of his gun. The heavy ammo box on its side was still mostly full, and so he ripped a continuous stream of copper-jacketed armor piercing death at the enemy soldiers as he stomped towards them at speed. 3 of them were cut down almost immediately. A large human and 2 slaviths slamming to the ground as the bullets tore fist-sized holes through their light combat armor as if it were made of wet paper. The others scattered, a Vinarfelian soldier surprising him briefly by immediately scaling the wall and then hanging upside down from the roof with its multitude of insectoid legs digging into the ceiling for purchase. It hit him 4 times in the upper chest and shoulder before he adjusted his fire to them. The bullet slammed into them as the large 6-meter form of the centipede-like alien smashed through the remains of a ticket stand amid a rainblood and chitin fragments. The body thrashed for a few seconds and then was still, bright red blood leaking from the sundered flesh and from gaps in their thick carapace armor. He felt another spray of impacts hit him in the side, this one almost knocking him back a step as the furious-looking Yawn in heavy armor screamed at him. They dropped the spent magazine to the ground and hurriedly reached for another, as the smoking barrel of their gun stayed aimed at him unwaveringly. Caden cursed under his breath and let out a wheeze. Damn, that had hurt a little. He could feel several new bruises forming where the interior of his ballistic bucky weave had deformed slightly to transfer energy into his body. But it had held, the thinner plating there having sufficiently slowed the bullets and prevented them from breaking through. Despite the series of smoking holes punched through the armor, the Yawn had finished reloading and snarled again, their gun spitting another line of fire at him even as he turned to present the thicker armor of his front towards this threat. This time he was rocked back a step as the heavy bullets dug sparking craters into the outer plates of his suit. Fragments of glowing metal were thrown from the impacts, but once more, the plates held. Just die already, you big dumb metal fuck. The Yawn started to scream again at him before they were launched backwards into the wall amid the flash of high-velocity impacts. Bright red blood splashed, and scraps of meat hung from the tatters of their ruptured chest cavity as Justin stepped through the door and into the room. He seemed to smirk and then spoke over their internal comms. "No you." Caden's response was cut short as he saw the final enemy stepping out of cover over Justin's wide, armored shoulder. The other ground pounder must have sensed the danger or seen it in their rear-facing camera as the man dropped ungracefully to the floor, just as a series of eye-searingly brilliant purple flashes cut a burning swath through the space his helmet had just occupied. A single shot to the back of the head with the powerful laser weapon likely would not have killed him, but multiple in such quick succession might have pierced even the thick cranial armor of Justin's demolisher armor. Caden turned his own gun to the offending Black Star with a snap, and the clatter of chains before the roar of its fire drowned out all other sounds. The room was suddenly lit by the bright flashes of the heavy machine gun's belligerent fury, the scenes of carnage taking on an almost dreamlike quality in the subsequent staccato illumination. After less than a second, he let up and nodded at his handiwork. What was left of the enemy had been splashed across the walls and floor like spilled milk, the blood steaming slightly from the sheer destruction wrought upon it by the powerful bullets. Justin climbed to his feet slowly with a slight groan. Damn, too bad this thing's dampeners don't activate for such a small fall. That kind of hurt. I think I split my eyebrow on the inside of my helmet. Something is dripping into my eye. Caden slapped the man heavily on the shoulder with a loud clang. "We'll check it out when the coast is clear. That was only half a fire team. That means the other half is probably still nearby, and I would bet you my S-rations for a week that they would have heard that." As quickly as they could without causing unnecessary ruckus, the two of them moved from the main opening to the main side hall of the structure. His suit had gotten a read on Val's position right before they had been attacked. She was on the upper floor of the theater, likely in what constituted the building's administrative section that overlooked the rest of the concourse outside. Her signal had gone dark, though, either blocked by a quirk of the building's structure or some other much darker reason. He looked left and then right, not really sure as to which way led upwards. He trusted his gut and moved to the left. They made it less than 5 meters before the sounds of shouting reached him. He couldn't make out distinct words, but they sounded pissed off and ready to fight. So he nodded to Justin and then braced himself with his gun raised and aimed down the yawning dimness of the darkened hallway. 2 enemies came flying around a corner up ahead and were almost immediately shredded, their bodies slamming to the carpeted flooring before they even had the chance to take up firing positions. The other hegemony soldiers, upon seeing the fate of their comrades, wisely decided to remain in the relative cover they had come from. While Caden would have normally been fine with slowly and methodically grinding them down, he just didn't have that kind of time to take things safely. Justin had the same idea, apparently, as he nodded towards the gun barrel that had just poked around the corner and started blasting streams of bright red tracers at them. Smoldering pockmarks appeared all over the wall and floors around them as desperate and inaccurate fire was hurled indiscriminately their way, the sounds of ricochets zinging off their heavy armor only satisfying Kaiden's resolve. He grinned to himself. "Double-wide rush. Keep up," he said, and then he took off with Justin at his side, the pounding footfalls of their combined weight sounding like the stampeding onrush of beasts in the confined space. His gun's retractor chain clattered as he let go of it and grabbed his thermomass from his other hip. He thumbed the activation switch, and almost immediately, the flanged blades of its armor-piercing head began to glow orange with tremendous heat. He heard Justin's Plascon truncheon activate with a crackling hiss of ionized air as the contained plasma stream lit the younger man with an ominous purple glow. Caden debated letting out a yell or inspiring shout, but then they rounded the bend much to the immediate surprise and dismay of the Neravith woman standing at the corner of the hall. She yelled in surprise and tried to scramble back, her gun raising as it stitched a line of superheated craters up the front of Caden's suit. But then he struck back. By this time, the head of his thermomace was glowing white-hot, the air around it seeming to smoke as the 4,000 degramer. Hafnium carbonitride blades reached near to the temperature of a star's roiling surface. His first swing smashed the woman's gun from her hands amid a shower of sparking fragments of molten polymer and metal, the skin of her hands suffering. Burns from the near miss and the sleeves of her shirt blackening from the heat of his terrible weapon. Before she even had the chance to scream, he planted the bladed mace in her skull right between her horns, crushing it with the superhuman strength of his armor and spraying smoldering blue blood across the hall amid the sound of splintering. Bone. He yanked the weapon free with a crunch and noted that the blood turned to acrid smoke as the superheated mace boiled it off, leaving not so much as a dark blemish behind. He turned and saw another enemy catch Justin's Plascon weapon to the face. There was a snap as the back of their head was sent into the wall with bone-shattering force, but they had already been dead at that point. The roiling plasma that had been contained within the weapon flashed the entire front of the man's head to ash and steam as it contacted. Both weapons were made to deal with lightly armored targets, and neither of the hegemony troopers had stood a chance. There was gunfire above, and Justin asked, "More?" Caden spoke urgently. "Val!" They rushed towards the sound of the fire, finding a stairwell that led to the higher floor. Justin took the stairs first, and Caden was about to follow when he heard a sound that made him stop in his tracks. The distinct sound of a grenade spoon releasing. "Justin, stop!" he yelled over the comms. But it wasn't fast enough. He was knocked to the ground as a terrific explosion consumed the enclosed space that Justin had just occupied. Slightly dazed and more than a little angry, Caden stood to his feet and cursed aloud as he saw the devastated stairwell's remains. Luck. "Damn it! Justin! Justin, can you hear me?" Caden stepped forwards as rubble crunched under his armored feet. The stairwell was gone, reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble, as one of the walls had also collapsed into the mess from the concussion of the grenade going off. He growled under his breath. Two could play at that game. Caden yanked a grenade from his own belt and wrenched the pin out with authority before throwing it through the doorway at the top of the stairs like a meteor of vengeance. There was a yell, and then another explosion rocked the building as wicked fragments tore the room at the top apart in a cloud of gray smoke. An armored gauntlet punched through the rubble in front of him, followed closely by the dusty and slightly scorched form of Justin as he crawled from the devastation below. He stumbled slightly. If the blast had dazed Caden, it had probably nearly deafened the other man even inside of his suit. But his armor looked to have held, though it looked much worse than it had moments before. He seemed to have lost his Plascon truncheon, but the slightly battered M112 rifle hanging from his side seemed relatively intact. He gripped the younger man's shoulder and asked, "Are you okay? Justin, speak to me." A groan came over the link, and presently the man spoke. "I feel like I just got kicked in the head by a ranks, but I think I'm all right." He seemed to notice his hand was empty. "And I lost my beat stick. Damn it. I loved that thing. Luck, damn it." Caden smirked. Yeah, he was all right. Just pissed off, Caden understood how the man was feeling. He looked at the smoke billowing from the shredded opening now nearly out of reach above them. "We need to find another way up. No way we can get there from here now. There must be another exit," he muttered. Justin just continued to look at him, the man's demeanor either attentive or completely shell-shocked. It was hard to tell when his face was just the dull iron mask of his armor. He turned off his thermomace and hung the rapidly cooling weapon on his hip. The specialized guard would keep the residual heat from damaging his armor, but he still felt as though the heat leaked through his armor and made that side of his body hot. But he knew he was imagining it. They walked quickly back the way they had come, wary of any more traps or enemy troops, but the space around them was blissfully quiet. The still smoking holes of their previous bout flashed by as they tried. The other end of the theater's hall. As he had suspected, there was another intact stairwell leading to a higher level here. They took it slowly, and this time Caden went first, motioning for Justin to give him a wide gap in case of another explosive attack. But no grenades came tumbling out of the yawning doorway above. No gunfire smacked him, and no shouts of anger could be heard. He poked his head out around the corner and then jerked back, anticipating incoming fire. But the quickly rewinded footage showed the top hall was clear. The room held no surprises, and so he gave the other man the all clear and moved forwards. The stairs creaked under the weight of Justin's armor as he came up them behind Caden, but by then he had already crossed the room and was peering into the next space warily. It looked empty as well. He spoke quickly over internal comms. "I think we are clear. Stay alert." He hadn't needed to add the last bit, but years of training were hard to ignore, and they slipped out without conscious thought. The two of them walked down a narrow hall and towards the front of the structure where Val seemed to have been hiding. Almost as if mocking his earlier assessment, there was a loud bang followed by the sound of weapons discharging from ahead, and then a heavy thud that shook the floor of the theater. Heedless of the danger to himself, Caden rushed towards the sound. There was a closed door in front of him, but he didn't slow to open it. The heavy wood shattered into spinning fragments as he charged through at full speed and scanned the room he had burst into. He raised his gun as he caught sight of a terrifyingly massive young female standing over a prone armored form. The figure on the ground was wearing placard power armor emblazoned with the colors of the Union. It was Val. She was down, not moving that he could see. He feared the worst and opened up on the Yone, but to his shock, his weapon only fired 3 rounds before it clicked on an empty belt. He had burned through the entire ammo box and was out of ammo. He watched as 2 of the heavy rounds tore long gashes out of the Yone's chest plate before catapulting off with a sound like a million angry bees. The 3rd shot went wide as the creature was knocked back by the force of the impacts, landing hard enough to shake the floor in their heavy combat armor. Justin yelled something and raised his own gun, but as he pulled the trigger, it simply clicked and then stopped. "Shit! Jam!" was all the other man yelled frantically as he scrabbled at his weapon in a desperate attempt to clear the blockage. Then he was rocked back by a flurry of shots from the Yone as they sat up and sprayed the other man with gunfire. Justin was forced to retreat to the other room as Caden let go of his gun and drew his thermomace again. He had a tiny window of opportunity, and he took it. He didn't even bother to activate the heavy melee weapon and instead whipped it towards the Black Star in a vicious overhand arc that sent it sailing towards the enemy soldier. It caught the barrel of their gun as they managed to maneuver it in front of the improvised projectile. There was a satisfying snap as the gun shattered in their grip, the impact likely bruising or breaking a few of the alien's fingers. But instead of falling down or cowering back, the big woman climbed to her feet and drew a wicked-looking blade as she opened her toothy maw and let out a shriek of anger. The blade's edge was heavy and thick, the body curved like a cleaver. And as she held it, the blade began to hum as it shimmered, and then seemed to almost turn into a ghostly shade of itself. She had a shiver steel weapon. He cursed internally. It was both good and bad news, as the weapon would be much less effective against his armor than she might have liked. But if she got in a good shot on one of his joints, the cavitation damage of the vibrating weapon could likely tear his entire arm or leg off. One mistake could cost more than just his own life here. Experience dictated that he needed to be incredibly careful. So Caden did the opposite. Remembering the times he had tussled with the prodigious, near superhuman strength of the Yone before, he decided that the best thing he could do would be to go on the offensive. And so he gave a shout and rushed the woman. Clearly his tactic had some merit, as the woman gave her own shout of surprise and then pain, as he simply plowed straight into her in what could be considered a classic G-ball tackle. But once more, the prodigious strength of the alien surprised him, for the move would have turned almost any other combatant into gooey paste upon the wall or floor behind them. But the woman instead pushed up and to the left with her powerful legs and thick tail, using his own momentum against him as she managed to throw him off and through the nearby wall. He crashed through the bricks and sheetrock like a wrecking ball, landing on the floor in a heap as his dazed mind took precious moments to catch up to his new and confounding reality. Scraps of shattered brick and dust settled around his body as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Before he even had the chance to climb back to his feet, a brick sailed through the dust and clanged off the front of his helmet hard enough to shatter into red fragments. But it would take a lot more than that to rattle him in his demolisher armor. Caden climbed to one knee just as the Yone woman stepped through into the room, the large butchering blade held low and ready as her bright green eyes flicked to him. Her pupils narrowed and she spat. You are the one that killed. All my pack! You will die in agony, wretch! And she rushed at him, bloody spittle flying from her peeled-back lips, her heavy tail smashing rubble aside as she powered towards him. He managed to dodge her first heavy swing, but the second carved a series of groves into his left vambrace, and the third carved a notch out of his helmet's cheek armor. He found himself on the back foot, no weapon and nothing with which to attack. He couldn't use his gun, the barrel would be ruined by the fiercely humming weapon's hardened blade, and it was out of ammo anyways. He had no time to reload it. As he blocked another swing with his arm amid a shower of glittering metal flakes, he thought he heard another noise coming from behind him. Apparently the Yone heard it too, as they turned their head and then seemed to tense. Their mouth opened and they started to turn their body to face the incoming threat. And then they were gone. A cloud of dust and spiraling masonry fragments, all that remained where the enemy had once stood. Caden took a second to catch his breath before he realized what must have happened. Justin had come around the side and tackled the furry alien. Through the wall to his left, the pair of them were still struggling on the floor in the next room even as he watched. He looked around for something and then heard a weak voice, not over the comms but from the room where Val had been. He poked his head through the first hole and saw the woman struggling to pull something from the belt at her side, but her movements were disturbingly sluggish, as if she had no strength at all. He thought about Justin alone with the hegemony woman, but realized that in his current unarmed state, he would not have been particularly useful. So he left Justin to finish taking out his anger on the poor hegemony soldier and walked quickly to the Neravith woman's side. He frowned as he finally realized what was wrong. Her suit was unpowered. The sensors of his armor were detecting a radiation leak from the rear of the placard armor. The microfusion reactor must have been breached when she landed, or possibly when the ship had been struck. She had managed to drag herself to the relative safety of the theater's upper floor before the power shut off completely. But without the reactor to power the internal servos of the heavy armor, she had been reduced to using the manual hydraulic actuators. It allowed her a degree of moment, but it was fitful and prone to jams. As he stood by her side, he heard her speak again, this time through the grill of her suit, as the small amount of auxiliary power she had used to warn him earlier must have become fully spent. That meant her backup Promethium power cell had likely been damaged, too. That was bad. Her voice was muffled, and he struggled to understand her speech. There was a series of loud bangs from the other room, and then silence. The tussle had been resolved. His face cracked into a small smile inside his helmet. Justin's indicator remained green, and presently the other man stomped out of the hole he had made in the wall with the Black Star's body. He was dusty and covered in splatters of blood and other undefinable matter, but he seemed in good enough spirits. Got her. Stupid bitch tried to stab me in the dick, so I shot her in the throat. Justin spoke bluntly and without embellishment, as was his style. Caden nodded at the man's crude report and then tapped Val's helmet with a finger. Hello, you awake in there, Val? He got his confirmation as a string of muffled curses came from the suit, the nearer arm making a glacially slow attempt to sucker punch him in the leg. He effortlessly stepped out of range with a small chuckle. Turning to Justin, he gripped one of the powerless woman's shoulders. Help me get her back up against that wall. The two of them dragged her heavy inert body to the nearby wall and propped her in a sitting position while Caden leaned her forwards to get a better look at her power plant, muffled shouting coming from inside the armored coffin her powerless suit had become. It was indeed damaged and leaking thick brown sludge. His Geiger meter started screeching at him much more noticeably now that he was right next to it. Generally, the plant was nearly inert from the outside, but as it had ruptured, some of the contents had clearly mutated into more unstable isotopes that were now spitting out in an unholy bath of radioactive vitriol. He got out a canister of neutralizer and began to spray the hardening anti-rad foam all over the back of her armor and wherever he saw more of the leakage. It would fill the cracks and act like an additional layer of shielding due to its very high hydrogen content by molar weight. It took precious seconds, but wasn't something he could leave undone. In a few moments, he had the situation largely handled, and his Geiger readings slowly settled back into a dangerous semi-yellow range. Good enough for the moment, though they were all going to need an anti-rad shower before they got out of their armor. He nodded to Justin. Get that thing off her. Justin reached forwards and undid the electromag clasps in the middle of her helmet. The entire thing broke into two halves, and as he pulled them apart, Val's face was exposed to the dusty air of the room. She coughed, a trickle of bright blue. Blood dried on her lips and chin like a thin line of cracking paint. Her horned head was topped with short-cropped raven-black hair, and her deep violet eyes burned with a malicious judgment. She spoke, her slightly husky tenor reminding Caden of Ixie as she cursed. By the 5 hells, could have given me a bit more warning before you started dragging me around like some sort of dead animal. She seemed pissed off, but very much alive. That was good. Caden moved in front of her and asked in a flat tone, "Status report." She looked him up and down, her arms still hanging by her sides as her face took on a nearly incredulous look. "Status report? What in the... I ought to pull your tongue out for that. Lords, what were you thinking, Caden?" She hissed, bright, eyes squinting at him. He wasn't entirely sure what he had done to set the pink-skinned alien off, but she seemed rather buggered nonetheless. "I need to know if you have any internal injuries or other problems. I can't check the auto doc. Diagnosis on your suit as it's dead, so I am asking, politely, what is your current status? Please, Val." He added a touch of genuine concern to his normally straightforward inflection. That seemed to work to calm her down a little as she cocked her head and just blinked slowly at him for a moment. Then she nodded, her voice cooling. Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, sir. I have a fractured lower tibial arch bone in my left arm and at least 2 cracked ribs, but all in all, I am at least 90% combat effective. Sir." She tried to give a salute but failed as the whining hydroservos in her arm failed. Caden shook his head. She was a willful one. Neravith always were difficult to work with. Their inhuman levels of determination and drive made most humans look weak-willed in comparison. He had no doubts that if he gave her a gun and told her to kill an entire company in her current state, she wouldn't bat an eye. But in the same vein, they were stubborn beyond reason in other aspects, making them difficult to command. Unless you had their total confidence and respect, so he decided that he would lay it out straight for her. "I am not going to sugarcoat it, Val," he began, and he saw Justin's head turn towards him as he reached up and unclasped his own helmet. It came away with the slight hiss of depressurization as he took a deep breath of the fresh air in the dingy room. Radiation be damned. He had been cooped up for too long. He rolled his shoulders slightly in his suit and then continued. "Our survival depends on speed, and in order to get you moving, we either need to abandon the suit as it's dead." She shook her head slightly, deeply against the idea. He could understand the feeling well. Justin piped up, "We could connect to her via a power couple. At least that way she would be able to move." Val looked skeptical. "I see the problem. Sir, you can leave me here. Just give some of the guns those Black Stars don't need anymore. And their ammo. I can hold out. Maybe even provide a distraction so you and Justin can get away from..." Caden snarled, his declarant protestation cutting her off mid-sentence. "Stop it with your stubborn dancer pride?" The slur took the pink-skinned woman by surprise, but it had worked to shock her out of the downward self-sacrificing spiral she had been riding. "I am not leaving you or anyone behind. Either we all get out of this, or you won't have to worry about taking orders from me anymore." He didn't say why. They all knew why. Caden stopped, breathing hard from the adrenaline his anger had spiked. Sweat was beaded on his brow from his earlier exertions, and he forced himself to stand with mild difficulty. Justin and Val were silent. He felt amped up by the whole mess. His blood sang with fire, and he wanted to kill, to hurt the enemies of the Union who had caused this whole damnable war. He gestured to Justin. "Hook up to her suit. I want you two watching for any sign of danger, though. There could be anything between us and safety at this point." There was a sound in the doorway, and then a deep, growling voice spoke. "That won't be necessary, Justin." Enter the room as she was the only one of them that didn't seem surprised. Justin and Caden, on the other hand, leapt into motion, the pair of them diving for any relative cover as Caden tried to instinctively put himself between Val and the perceived threat. But he needn't have bothered. It wasn't some enemy looking to capitalize on their turned backs. Indeed, if it had been, they could likely have downed both Caden and Justin before either had the chance to turn their heavier frontal armor towards the threat. Stupid of them to have let their guard down. He cursed himself for the lapse even as he stood and looked at the newcomer warily. The figure that now filled the doorway was large enough that their broad shoulders scraped the frame on both sides, the large pauldrons of their armor cracking the wood and masonry as they forced their way through. The figure was large, their frame exaggerated by the complex power armor they wore over their alien form. Their long arms hung nearly to the ground. In them was clutched a truly impressive-looking weapon. The crackling coils of the heavy Gauss rifle fizzed in the air as they reslung the GR-95H across their back with a slight clatter. Their arrival was accompanied by another green indicator popping up on Kaiden's HUD. This time he recognized the bulky figure of Harvey in his strange alien power armor before he even read the new icon. The big alien was hard to miss. Harvey took several steps forwards. His heavy tail held only just above the ground behind him as he reached Val's, sighed, and knelt on one digitigrade knee. "I will assist her." His beast-faced helmet turned to look at Kaiden as if daring him to say no, but he didn't. Something in the Yaun's voice told him that it had not been a request, and he respected the man enough to not make it an issue. Instead, he just nodded. Gesturing to Justin, he said, "All right, you and me will take point and drag." As he continued speaking, he unclipped the spent box mag and replaced it with another from his waist with practiced efficiency. Normally, he would hold onto the spent boxes, but this time he tossed it aside. He would not get the chance to reload it, and there was no reason to carry the bulky container if it was empty. He would ask forgiveness from logistics when they made it back to the base. Surely they would understand. He nodded towards Val and Harvey as the large alien attached insulated cables from the rear of his armor to corresponding slots on the damaged power plant of her damaged suit. "You two will hold the middle. Harvey, will Val's gun put too much strain on your power plant?" The man seemed to hesitate. "It could," Justin spoke up quickly. "No problem. Val, you can use mine, and I will hold onto your tri-beamer." "For you," Kaiden frowned. It was a bit unorthodox, but it ensured they would not be down a gun if things got hot again. Val herself seemed to hesitate, her eyes turning to look first at Justin and then back at Harvey before she confirmed, "Okay, but you had better treat Gary with the same respect you would treat your own father with." Kaiden heard Justin snort, before making a solemn promise not to allow harm to befall her beloved gun. Kaiden was attached to his own weapon. The bulky, heavy machine gun had gotten him out of more close scrapes than he could rightly recall. He had not named it, though. He cocked his head. Maybe he should. Could be good luck.